Gnosis. This is part 3 of 4 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva of Virginia Tech, talking about personal deification. Last time we talked about the kings and gods of the kings and emperors of the ancient world as gods and what the political ramifications of that were. We talked about the Gnostic cosmology as an act of political defiance, and we talked about where in the New Testament Jesus actually considered divine or not. In this episode, we're going to talk about ordinary people and can they become divine themselves. We're going to talk about theonomy and how God gives his name to people and what that means in terms of personal divinity. And Simon Magus, we spend a bit of time talking about him, one of our favorite folks here on Talk Gnosis. And then we close things out with a conversation about Yaldabaoth and how his self-deification affects the personal deification that we all experience. So stick around and watch all of this episode, part 3 of 4 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva of personal deification.
So, Dr. Litva, we've been talking about these special divine figures, kings, rulers, Jesus. We haven't really talked about ordinary Joes becoming divine. Is there ideas, like even in the Bible or in, say, a leading question, the letters of Paul about how normal people can become divine or become experience this theosis?
Well, it depends on what you mean by divine. Usually a god is going to be defined by two basic properties. A god is going to be an immortal being with superhuman power. And if you can combine both of those, typically in the ancient world, you can be categorized as a deity. So in the Garden of Eden story, Adam gets only one of those characteristics. He gets a power of knowing good and evil. But in order to prevent his full deification, Yahweh removes him from the tree of life, which will prevent him gaining immortality. I think what Paul does is he gives believers both gifts, but he gives it to them as so often as chiefly an afterlife scenario. He believes that the believer in Jesus is undergoing a present transformation. And it's a transformation enabled by Spirit, which exists within us and is transforming us from within. And we are gaining a kind of power through that Spirit. But the second element, immortality, is only going to be an end to time or eschatological gift. And we are going to eventually have our bodies more or less cannibalized, so to speak, by the Spirit, who is going to transform our outer flesh into a spirit reality. And we are going to then not exist under the conditions of entropy or decay. And this will occur either at the so-called parousia or second coming of Jesus, or, it will definitely occur then for both the dead and the living. So it's something that we have to wait for. But in spirit form, once we attain spirit form, I don't think there's any doubt that we would qualify as deities who have both superhuman power and immortality. This is one of the things that Nietzsche complained about Christianity. He said, that immortality used to be something grand, but now every Peter and Paul can get it, and you have diluted the true heroic Greek mentality and given it to the masses. And that is why your religion is disgusting. But, of course, from the Christian point of view, that is why the religion is grand, that we now have a democracy of gods within a larger theocracy.
And do you think this would be Paul's view? Just just when we put it in that kind of terminology, it sounds almost shocking to many modern ears, right? If I went into, I believe many churches, and I'm not dumping on any church, but many church, and said, Paul said we're all going to become gods. It'll be a democracy of gods. I think there's kind of a monocle falling out. But do you believe that would be his perspective? That's how he would view it?
Well, Paul is going to speak in his own distinctive ways, and I think we need to be clear, and I hope that I'm clear as a scholar, that I'm coming at it from an outsider, sometimes called an edict perspective, that I don't pretend to be representing exactly Paul's language or just redescribing Paul's language. That would be an entirely boring task. I am creating new categories which I think are faithful to Paul's thought and which I think expresses true meaning. But I don't say, I never have said that Paul speaks in exactly this kind of language. But I think in terms of the realm of antiquity, deification is what I call a native category. That is a category with which people were familiar with. And if someone comes in and preaches a message of immortality, the reception of a spirit body, and superhuman power, then he is preaching the gospel of deification, even if those words have not been invented.
Go ahead, Father.
Well, I was thinking that there was a couple of digressions that could happen at this point, but maybe should be saved for other shows. But I'll say them out loud anyway. We had Richard Hodges on the show a couple of weeks back, and to talk about Gurdjieff. And one of the things we talked about is the immortality of the soul and whether or not that is an innate quality of every person, or if that's something that can be or it has the potential to be, I should say, developed over time, and whether or not that deification is something that is something that happens to all people or all believers or just those people who worked really hard at it. Kind of a topic maybe for another time, and the other one has gone from my brain, so maybe it'll come back later. You know how that
happens. Father, actually, I'll let you take the next question on the sheet because I don't know how to say that word.
Theonomy? Is that the one?
Yep.
So what's theonomy?
Well, it depends on how you're spelling it.
Oh, okay.
I'm spelling it with a Y, and what I mean by that is sharing a divine name. That often deification in a Jewish way is expressed by the idea that God gives his name to people. And this is more than just a cute metaphor for, now your name's something else. It's a way for God to share his power, because his name represents his authority and his status, and some would say his very being. So in the case of Jesus, and I argue in the so-called hymn in Philippians 2, where Jesus receives the name above all names, it's clearly not just some kind of cute, perfunctory ceremony that's a mere formalistic. No, when he gets the name of God, then he becomes God, and his status is actually clearly raised. And this is a clear example of deification, or a deification tradition, in a particular with a particular Jewish local color being applied to Jesus. So theonomy means that application of the divine name to a human being, which is a mode of deification.
Yes, and I'm reminded of we talk a lot about internally. We talk a lot about Margaret Barker and temple theology, and one of the points that she likes to make is that the high priest is called Yahweh, is called the divine name, and actually takes on the either exists as Yahweh on earth, or kind of takes on or invokes Yahweh into themselves as part of that. And so I think that language is pointing directly to that tradition.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And again, it's just it's a Jewish way of expressing this transfer of power and status, and in some cases being. And so, yes, they don't use the language of deification. Yes, that's a later linguistic development. But it's definitely there. They're using their own local expressions for it. But they have their own way of putting it. But that sense of the investment of supreme power in an individual, that's participating in God's divine energies. That's participating in a clearly superhuman power and status. That is deification.
Into the more Gnostic-y part, I mean, in my opinion, the whole show's been pretty Gnostic-y, but more specifically, who is Simon of Samaria, and why do you call him a self-deifying hero?
Well, Simon of Samaria is, I would call him, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, more or less a highly mythologized figure, just as Jesus is a highly mythologized figure. That is, we may be able to reconstruct a certain core about this person as a historical human being. But that's not the point. The point is that we have a figure who seems to, in my opinion, be Christian and live or do his ministry in the area of Samaria, which is just south of Galilee, and who, according to tradition, by means of his speculative insight, realized that the divine fire was something not boxed up in some fourth dimension and separated from the world, but that the divine fire was spread all throughout the universe and exists in seed form in the human heart. Coming to a superhuman consciousness, that is, awakening our superhuman consciousness, essentially God wakes up within us and begins the process of evolving into the absolute deity that he truly is. And so there's a Trinitarian idea that there's a God who is in seed form, a God who is developing, and a God who is in a state of fullness or perfection. And it's Simon who it seems to be the first person to realize that he is in and part of this larger process of awakening divinity to its true self, and in that process realizes his own divinity. Not because it was an arrogant claim, or that he was a megalomaniac, or that he was an evil heretic, but because he realized that this process of God coming to fullness and consciousness involved himself and his own transformation of consciousness. Now, according to later tradition, Simon was vilified as the first heretic and the creator of the Gnostic movements. This, of course, is a tragic misrepresentation of who this figure actually was. And one of the points in the new book dealing with self-deification is to show that actually Simon and Jesus, as depicted in the Gospel of John at least, are radically parallel figures. And it's a case where, again, I wouldn't say that there's winners and losers, but there are Simonian Christians and there are Johannine Christians, and they are in a kind of competition. And in the end, they're borrowing ideas from each other. And both communities, neither community wins, both die out. But it just so happens that we have preserved the Gospel of John in the New Testament, and the only Simonian document that we have exists in the Refutation of All Heresies, which I talked with you when I was here last time. Mm-hmm. It is the only genuine Simonian document written in Simon's name. I don't personally think it was written by any historical Simon, but like the Gospel of John, it was written by a community who venerated the founder as a deified figure, and it tells Simon's philosophy or theology, and it is one of the most beautiful pieces of literature, of Gnostic literature anyway, that we possess. It's called the Great Declaration, or the Megali Apophasis. It's in Book 6 of the Refutation of All Heresies.
Amazing.
Yeah, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners will be familiar with that figure specifically. Yeah, he's a kind of a favorite around here.
Yeah. Father, do you want to take the next question? Another favorite who comes up on the show a lot.
Sure, yeah, and also, let's do this next question, and then I'll come back. So we talk a lot about Yaldabaoth on this, if that's how one would pronounce it, on this show as the demiurge of the Sethian mythos. What does he have to do with self-divinization?
Well, that's a great question, and again, in the new book, he gets his own chapter. I pronounce it Yaldabaoth. It's a fascinating figure. The point that I try to make about this figure is it's very clear that in Gnostic tradition, his chief sin, his chief blasphemy, is to say exactly what Yahweh says in the Hebrew Bible, that I am God and there's nobody beside me. In other words, the chief sin of this figure is to create a universe where it's exclusively monotheistic, but the whole premise is a wicked lie and based on an arrogant claim of a really ignorant or ignoramus deity who is more or less a kind of adolescent anyway, but is depicted as an abortion or a miscarriage of divine wisdom. Now, what I think is the important point, for me anyway, about this figure is that he makes the same claim that God makes, or Yahweh makes, in the Hebrew Bible. So it's clear that the Gnostics are parroting Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. But it's interesting that when people read Yahweh saying, for instance, in Isaiah, I am the only God, there is no God beside me, and worship me alone, they try to defend him and say that, yes, well, he's right. He is the only God, and we ought to worship him and give him honor. And the Gnostics basically turn this on its head and says, don't you see that this is the most arrogant claim that anyone could make? And it is inherently false because he doesn't have all the power. And there is something in us which tells us that the tyrant who runs this universe, the demonic infrastructure and bureaucracy, and leads us into all, to fulfill our commercialized lusts and ignore the important things in life, the great questions about getting free and true freedom, not just, what kind of toothpaste I can freely choose at the supermarket, but I mean true freedom. The God who is trying to prevent that is telling a lie that we know to be a lie because we have the divine spark and the divine power within us. And so we know that anyone who claims to have all the power and to be the only God and to not allow any participation, not allow any deification, that being must be the primal liar, the father of lies. Because we experience it in our own selves. We experience divinity within us. And it's by virtue of that experience that we know that any force in this universe who tries to take that power away from us, who tries to say that we're just dust, that we're just nothing, and we are cogs in this vast wheel, and we will die when the sun dies in 2 billion years, and in 5 billion years there will never be a memory that the human race existed. That kind of basic philosophy is a lie from hell. And it's the Yaldabaoth character is the one who shows that, because we know he's lying, but it is parroting Yahweh, but it's not the true Yahweh. It's not the true God. The Gnostics aren't saying that God is a lie. They're saying that there is a true God who shares his divinity, who is beyond name and beyond knowing. But there are these other divinities, these other powers in this world who come in and say, no, we have all the power, or we have all the money, I guess in American culture, and you people are nothing. You 99% have nothing. You're not worth anything. That's the lie that I think these Gnostics are trying to expose, and they expose it through the character of Yaldabaoth.
This is part 4 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva of Virginia Tech, talking about personal deification. In this final part, we are talking about some interesting things, but last time we talked about how ordinary people can become divine and can be deified themselves. We talked about theonomy, which was an interesting concept of God giving his name to people. Chatted a bit about Simon Magus, and we talked about Yaldabaoth as a self-deifying rebel. In this episode, we continue our conversation about Yaldabaoth, and we talk about whether or not he gets redeemed through the creation mythos, or whether he just kind of remains stubborn to the end. We then talk about Lucifer and how he is also a self-deifying rebel, and kind of how his story is a cautionary tale. We talked about deification in the Gospel of Thomas, one of our favorite texts, the error of deification by grace, and we talk about how self-deification happens today. So you're going to want to watch all the way to the end to see how you too can become God using this one easy trick. So coming up, part 404 of our conversation with Dr. M. David Litva, personal deification. And Yaldabaoth, is there any hope for him? does he come out? Does he say, "Oh, you know what? Maybe I was wrong"?
That's interesting, because in certain texts of Nag Hammadi, we have a secondary character called Sabaoth, who is depicted as Yaldabaoth's son, and Sabaoth does repent. He looks at his father's error, and he essentially says, "Dad, I'm out of here. I'm going to lift myself up to a higher level of heaven that's higher than you, and I'm going to rule as a deity, and let you have your own little world below, which you're eventually going to be imprisoned and destroyed." But there is a sense, I think, in Gnostic texts that an archon can repent, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem that Yaldabaoth makes that decision.
I have a wild theory that I'm working on right now that's based on nothing at all. That Yaldabaoth is actually part of a trinity that between Yaldabaoth, Saklas, and Samael. That he's a kind of a Trinitarian concept that exists within the Sethian corpus. But like I said, there's no no textual or literary reference to that. I just like it.
Well, you got 2 out of 3 there with Sabaoth being a son. So
right.
Sorry, I zoned out for a bit. What were we saying about Trump again?
Oh no!
Usually, boom.
We'll lose our nonprofit status. Cut it out.
Yeah. All right. That's right. All right. No politics. Okay.
Right.
I guess moving on, although that's fascinating. Again.
Actually, before we go on to the next question, sorry, now I screwed up the graphics. Sorry, Dan. I also wanted to mention, in addition to the people we've already talked about, people or figures or deities that we've already talked about from your book, you talk about Lucifer also. Can you do a quick little summary of where Lucifer fits into all of this?
Yeah, Lucifer, or as he's called in the Hebrew Bible, Helel ben Shachar, that is the Shining One, son of the dawn goddess. He is depicted as a kind of primal self-deifying figure. In Isaiah 14, he has this great scheme where he's going to rise upon the clouds and assault the divine council and sit on the throne of God. And even before he's done thinking, he is thrown down into the and I think this is the primal fear of Hebrew religion, that you could have a tyrant, and the true tyrant is the one who claims absolute power. And I think if you're an ancient Israelite, this terrifies you, as it should terrify us today, that self-deification is, in many cases, and we should not deny it, it is the ultimate power grab. And it is the attempt to claim not just any power, but supreme power. And anyone who does that is, from the Jewish perspective or the Israelite perspective, is destined to fall. Now, I say that there are two myths of self-deification. There's the self-deifying rebel, and that would be this Hillel or Lucifer figure or Yaldabaoth. But there's also the self-deifying hero, in which they often come as a hidden deity or a deity in disguise, like Jesus and Simon. And they don't reveal their true identity, or they reveal it in a very gingerly way through miracles and through certain secret declarations. And they are actually persecuted on earth, and there's not a hint of arrogance about them. And in the end, although they might be killed and vilified, they do rise to the stars. And so there's two myths at work here, and we need to be very careful that both are biblical. That it's not just, we don't just have the self-deifying rebel, we also have the self-deifying hero. Because in principle, if you know what deity is and you know what it means to share power, then then deifying yourself in principle ought to involve not a sliver of arrogance.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. you have to be a special kind of crazy, which I think probably some of us can relate to want to say, you know what? Maybe I could be God. Why not? Why not me? So anyways, let's move on. We also talk a lot on this show about the Gospel of Thomas. Any ideas about deification hidden among the sayings of the Gospel of Thomas?
Yes, and I don't think they're quite hidden. I think this gospel is probably more than any other is the gospel of human deification. And it's, again, deification for the small man. You know, it's not just Jesus, as in the Gospel of John, strutting about and saying, I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am, and I'm the big stuff, and you guys follow me, and if you don't, you're damned. It's exactly the reverse in the Gospel of Thomas. It's the incredibly inclusive Jesus, the Jesus who is totally including people within his own deity. And this is really the key, that one becomes, if you're going to have a Christian theory of deification, Jesus isn't the guy who realizes his own divinity and he's the only God, form a new form of monotheism that we just call Trinitarianism, and nobody else can then be divine. That, I think, is a lie, and I think it's totally foreign to early Christianity and certainly foreign to the Gospel of Thomas. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus welcomes people into his own divinity and is simply a model for us to realize our own divinity in the most humane and mystical way possible, and through careful, humble, meditative reflection on the profound sayings of Jesus himself. And so the very things that are said of Jesus, that he is the light above them all, and saying 77 is similar to what we find said about regular Christians, and that we have the light within, and the Gospel of Thomas saying 24, and that we come from the light, and that we're the children of the light. So, and just as Jesus is the Son of God, we are the children of God. That's all over the New Testament as well. He has a kind of priority, but it's only a It's only relative priority. He's not a fundamentally different being than we are. We are, if we're doing things right, we're evolving to be what he is. He is the model. He is the way, not in the sense of the exclusive way. He's the way in the sense that he shows us who we really are. Mm-hmm. And unless we become Christ, we have missed the point.
In the Johannite liturgy, we refer to Jesus as the exemplar of our liberation, and I always like that as a symbol that, you know, it's he showed us the way, but we get to go too.
Mm-hmm. Skip ahead by 1,000 years or so, but we can say you were just talking about divine light, actually. But a lot of our listeners are interested in St. Gregory of Palamas and the hesychasm. Can you talk a bit about what you call deification by grace and about some of St. Gregory's ideas?
Well, that is quite a leap. What I'll say first is that there's a certain theological problem that I have with deification by grace. You have a lot of people today who believe in deification and are trying to make it kosher for Western Christians. And one of the ways to do this is to emphasize the idea of grace, which I think is fine in and of itself, but we can get trapped into this, especially if we try to fit it into exclusively Protestant formulations. As is well known, Luther preached salvation only by grace alone. And the idea seems to be that if we can make deification by grace and by grace alone, then we can make it kosher and acceptable for all Christians and not look like evil heretics, megalomaniacal blasphemers. This is all well and good, but one has to be very careful of distorting the teaching. And I think deification by grace is fine as far as it goes, but there's a danger of viewing deification as kind of like a gift, like you would receive a bicycle. Deification isn't
God gave
really...
me a bicycle and
and godhood.
Yeah.
That's Merry Christmas.
It's just not the point. Deification is an experience. And it involves your full body and your full spirit. And it's not something that God can hand you like a cookie. It's something that you're fully involved in and you're fully working toward. So if we just put this emphasis on grace, we essentially nod to Luther, which is fine if you like Luther. But the point is that in many cases, if salvation in the deepest sense is deification, it involves our whole body and everything that we do and think. And therefore it involves work and real prayer. And certainly this is true in the hesychastic tradition. You don't get deified by eating a donut, on the beach and by going to play video games and waking up at noon. You get deified because you're up at 4:30 with your head in, right, or your chin right against your belly button and praying fervently the prayer of Jesus, or the Jesus prayer, and doing this for hours and hours and hours until the light begins to shine in you. That's not eating a cookie. That's not God handing you deification. You're working toward that. And it's because of who you are and the fact that you are in your spirit compatible with the divine energies already, that deification in the Eastern tradition makes sense. So, sure, we can talk about deification by grace, but let's just be clear that we need to know a whole lot more about what's really involved here and not fool ourselves into thinking that this is something that we can just, like an implant or a pill we can eat, we'll wake up into a new consciousness as superhuman beings. No, this is something that our whole body and our whole soul and our whole spirit are involved in, and it is work, and it is hard work. And this is the spirit, it is a spiritual practice, and this is what Gregory supported.
It's the good news and the bad news of Gnostic salvation as well, right? Like, it's available to anybody, but you gotta work on it. You gotta do the work.
Yeah, because knowledge is not information.
Mhm.
It's experiential knowledge. And I don't care how much of Wikipedia you read, you're never going to deify yourself.
I always say, I just got to read one more book, and then then I'm done, right? Like, just.
Well, you go there.
How are we doing for time, Father?
6 minutes.
Oh, 6 minutes.
Ish.
Ish. Okay. Well, I would just like to go back to your previous Wikipedia and book comments. Of course, if you buy Dr. Litva's books and read them all, you will self-divinize.
Mhm.
So we'll
Guaranteed.
have links. Yep. We will
Well,
have
you
links
better
in
put your
the,
whole
in the
body
show
and
notes.
soul into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That burning sensation means that it's working.
Right.
Yeah. Before we end with the leading question I put at the end of the sheet, was there anything else you want to ask about, Father, that we've touched on?
Lots, but let's wrap it up and we'll continue this later, I guess.
Yeah. Dr. Lipa, I'm wondering, so we've talked a lot about the past. We went way back to the ancient world. We did skip ahead 1,000 years, but we're still far into the past. These ideas about self-deification, divinization, are they still around and believed and practiced? Can you find them outside of religion? Are they still in the modern world and in the West anywhere? Or are they just something interesting for scholars to read about?
Well, as far as I know, Christianity is still around, and it is and remains the cult of immortality, which promises immortality to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. And I think that is significant. I think the impulse toward the immortalization or the eternalization of ourself is one of the strongest impulses that is programmed into us biologically, and that we have various means of eternalizing ourselves. And some people have now, by technological means, taken this into their own hands. Transhumanists are thinking seriously about uploading their consciousness onto a supercomputer, or using biogenic implants and nanoprobes to not only increase their own consciousness potentially to an infinite level, but essentially to eternalize themselves on a different platform, to escape this wet platform we call the flesh and enter into essentially a digital or a cyber platform. There's other ways that one can imagine this happening. Mutation, the process of evolution pushing the human body into something much superior than it is right now. Again, other kinds of implants and tools, and sometimes people think that they can do this alone, and sometimes they think that they can do this together. But this impulse it's not just toward survival, it's toward immortalization. And I think everybody does this on some level, that we really think that if not our own individuality, then surely the race ought to be immortalized, or our community ought to be immortalized, whether it be our church or our nation, that we are valuable enough to be immortal. And I think this is what human rights is all about, that we are sacred. And even if our bodies die, our spirits are immortal, and we, in a sense, deserve to be immortal. And we think of ourselves or our communities as ultimate, even if they aren't. And we're still striving for this ideal, even if we never get there. And so I think it's definitely here. And I think deification is here to stay. And I think one now needs to talk about how to engage in the process responsibly, particularly when you do have people who are truly arrogant and might have billions of dollars in order to immortalize themselves while the rest of us just have kids and or just live horrible lives and die in agony without good medical treatment. we have a situation where we are now responsible for each other, responsible for keeping this planet in good enough order so that at least potentially the race could survive another 1,000 or another million years. And people need to be thinking about what myths we need to be using in order to responsibly think about eternalizing the human consciousness and the human race. And so we need to think about, is Superman going to be our myth, or Iron Man, the individual maverick who attains a kind of superhuman power and possibly immortalizes himself? Are we going to think on the superhuman model, or are we going to think of other models, ways that we can together forge ahead into the future and keep ourselves alive, at least live as if consciousness was eternal and as if we were worth remembering for the next billion years, even when the sun dies out? These are questions that we need to think about. These are stories that we need to tell, and we're responsible for the kind of stories that we tell about deification. Because if the tyrant does get control, if there is truly a self-deifying megalomaniac out there, a braggart, who could lead us to destruction, then we also need to bring him down. And so that is what I mean about keeping these myths, being responsible with how we think about eternalizing ourselves, which I think, because humanity is at bottom good, deification is good and something worth striving for.
Well, on that motivating note, thank you so much for joining us once again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. The book is Desiring Divinity, Self-Deification in Early Jewish and Christian Myth-Making. The author, Dr. M. David Litva of Virginia Tech. Thank you once again for joining us. It's always edifying to have you on the show.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Litva. That was amazing.
I know you told your friend you're not okay. And tell me what's wrong and why you never said you felt that way. And guess you're trying to stay strong and fake a